For 2 years, my life had been stuck on a loop. Wake up, stare at the ceiling, drag myself to work, come home, eat something tasteless, and fall asleep to the drone of the TV. My name is Ethan Walker, and at 31, I'd completely forgotten what it felt like to look forward to anything. Ever since my younger brother Jamie died in that car crash, I'd just stopped trying to feel alive. Grief had turned my world into static. Every laugh sounded distant. Every smile felt like a language I no longer spoke. I was living in a state of half-light. Never too happy, never too sad, just quietly existing. Then one Thursday, my best friend Sarah stormed into my office with her usual whirlwind of energy. "You're going on a blind date," she announced. I laughed, sure she was joking, but she just stood there, hands on her hips, grinning like she'd already won. "I'm serious," she said. "You need to meet people who don't live inside your computer screen." I tried to explain that I wasn't ready, that I didn't even know how to talk about myself without sounding broken. But Sarah wasn't having it. She'd seen me at my absolute lowest, sitting on my floor beside a half-packed suitcase, wondering if I should just run away or disappear entirely. I guess she thought a blind date was the antidote to all that silence. By Saturday, I had run out of excuses. She texted me the details. 7 p.m. at Lark Cafe. Be there. Dress like someone who still believes in first impressions. I almost canceled 3 times that day. My thumb hovered over the "I can't make it" message, but some small, quiet part of me, a part that still wanted to be known, kept me from hitting send. Lark Cafe was one of those places that looked like it belonged in a movie. Soft yellow lights, faint jazz music, and the smell of cinnamon and coffee wrapped around every conversation. Couples leaned in close across wooden tables, laughing in hushed tones. I felt like an intruder in a world that had already figured out how to move on. I told the hostess I was meeting someone, and she pointed toward a corner table by the window. A man was already sitting there, his back straight, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup. For a second, I thought there had been a mix-up. Sarah hadn't said anything about it being a man. He looked up and smiled, a calm, easy expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You must be Ethan." I hesitated, glancing at my phone, half expecting a message that would clear things up. But there it was. Lark Cafe, 7 p.m. No mistake. "I'm Daniel," he said, standing to shake my hand. His voice was low and warm, like someone used to speaking softly so others wouldn't feel threatened. Nice to meet you," I managed, trying to hide my confusion. He noticed anyway. "You weren't expecting me, were you?" I shook my head, embarrassed. I thought it was going to be someone else." "Sarah said the same about you," he said with a small, knowing laugh, easing back into his chair. "Guess she wanted us both surprised." There was something disarming about him, an openness that made me stay, even when every instinct told me to run. So I sat down. We ordered coffee, and the first few minutes were as awkward as you'd expect. Small talk, nervous glances, long pauses. But gradually, the silence between us softened. Daniel had this incredible way of listening. He didn't interrupt or try to fill the quiet spaces. He just looked at you, really looked at you, and somehow that felt safer than it should have. He told me he worked as a community counselor, helping people find jobs and housing after going through difficult times. "I guess I like listening to stories," he said with a faint smile, "especially the ones people are scared to tell." There was a gentle weight to his words, as if he was talking about something personal without actually saying it. I didn't push. Instead, I found myself opening up. I talked about Jamie, about the night everything changed, about how loss can make you forget who you are, how it can hollow you out until you're just a shell. When I finished, my voice trailing off, Daniel just nodded slowly. "You sound like someone who's been carrying a lot of silence." That sentence landed deeper than I expected. He didn't say it with pity. He said it with a profound sense of understanding. As the cafe started to empty around us, time began to feel elastic. What started as an obligation, a chore I had to get through, turned into something strangely peaceful. His laughter was quiet but genuine, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had lived through his own pain and still chose to be gentle. At one point, I had to ask, "Why did you agree to this blind date?" He smiled, his eyes glinting under the soft lights. Because Sarah told me you needed someone who wasn't afraid of ghosts. That line stayed with me long after the check arrived, echoing in my mind. When we finally stood to leave, rain had begun to fall outside. The streetlights shimmered on the wet pavement. And for a moment, the whole world looked almost cinematic. The kind of scene you remember for reasons you can't quite explain. "Thanks for staying," Daniel said as we stood by the door. "I know tonight wasn't what you expected." "It's okay," I said honestly. "Maybe that's a good thing." He smiled again, that same calm expression that seemed to hold both kindness and sorrow. "I'm glad you came, Ethan." He stepped out into the rain, pulling his jacket tighter. I watched him walk away, disappearing into the blur of streetlights and moving cars. Something about him felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. It was a strange, aching kind of recognition, like remembering a dream you weren't sure you'd even had. I drove home with the radio off, the sound of the rain filling the silence. My mind replayed fragments of our conversation, his quiet laughter, the way he said my name like it was something fragile he didn't want to break. When I reached my apartment, I sat in the car for a long time, just staring at my reflection in the rain-streaked windshield. For the first time in 2 years, the emptiness inside me didn't feel so endless. There was something new there, a faint pulse of curiosity, maybe even a sliver of hope. I didn't know who Daniel really was, or why his presence lingered like a question I couldn't stop asking. But as I turned off the engine and stepped into the quiet of my apartment, one thought refused to leave me. This night wasn't random. Somehow it meant something. And deep down, I could feel it. The story hadn't even begun yet. I never expected to hear from Daniel again. After that strange, quiet evening, I figured it was just one of those fleeting moments, two strangers filling a void of loneliness. But then, 3 days later, my phone buzzed. It was him. "Hey, it's Daniel. Would you want to grab dinner sometime this week?" I must have read that simple message 3 times before I finally typed back, "Sure, when and where?" We met at a small diner by the river, the kind of place that smells like old wood and vanilla milkshakes. Daniel was already there, sitting by the window, just like the first time. He seemed so calm, almost too calm, and it put me on edge. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice just as warm as I remembered. I gave a clumsy smile. "Yeah, well, I figured I owed you a proper conversation." He chuckled. Then his gaze drifted out the window for a long moment before turning back to me. "You really don't remember me, do you?" The question threw me. "Remember you? We've only met once." Daniel's eyes softened with a look I couldn't quite place. "Not exactly." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his fingers tracing the rim of his water glass. "You saw me before, Ethan, a long time ago. You might not realize it, but you were there." I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to connect the dots. "Where?" He let out a long, slow breath, like he'd been holding it for years. 2 years ago, downtown. A fight broke out near Franklin Street. You called for help." The air in the diner suddenly felt heavy, thick. My mind started to pull at these frayed, dusty edges of a memory. Flashing lights, shouting, a blur of red on wet pavement. I could almost hear it again, a faint voice crying out. I'd frozen that night, completely terrified, just watching as a group of strangers scattered before the sirens grew closer. Daniel's voice pulled me back to the present. "You don't remember my face, do you?" I shook my head slowly, my throat suddenly dry. I just remember blood. And someone screaming." "That was me," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You watched me bleed that night." The world just stopped. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversations, the soft music from the speakers, it all faded into a dull hum. I blinked, unable to form words. No. That can't be." "It's true," he said, his gaze gentle, unwavering. "I remember you. You were standing under that flickering streetlight. You froze, but you called the ambulance. You saved me, Ethan." A wave of dizziness washed over me. My chest tightened, and this heavy, sharp guilt rose up from a place I'd buried it long ago. I should have stayed, I managed to say. I should have done more. You did enough, he interrupted softly. You don't have to punish yourself for surviving a moment you didn't understand. But I couldn't shake the image now. That night had haunted me in these small, silent ways. I'd seen something terrible and done nothing but dial 3 numbers. I remembered the powerlessness, the way my hands had trembled. I'd convinced myself over time that the person I saw hadn't made it. I thought you died, I whispered, the words barely audible. Daniel offered a faint, fragile smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sometimes I thought I did too. He told me about the months of recovery that followed the attack, both physical and otherwise. The people who hurt him were never caught. It wasn't about them, he said, his voice low. It was about me learning to breathe again. The way he said it felt heavier than the story itself, as if this attack was just one more wound on a much longer list. I looked at him differently then. Beneath his calm exterior, there was a deep stillness, the kind that only comes from carrying too much pain for too long. Why tell me now? I asked, my voice shaky. He met my eyes. Because I've wanted to thank you, and because I think we both need to remember that night for what it was, not just for what it took from us. We sat in a shared silence. Outside, the river lights shimmered against the window, reflecting fragmented images of our faces. I could feel this unspoken weight between us, something delicate but profound. Finally, I looked at him and said, "You don't look like someone who needs saving anymore." Daniel smiled faintly. That's the funny thing about being saved. It doesn't end when the bleeding stops. It ends when you learn how to live again. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt so small, so useless. The man across from me wasn't a stranger anymore. He was a piece of a memory I had buried so deep I almost believed it wasn't mine. When the waiter brought the check, neither of us moved. Our hands brushed by accident, and for a split second, I felt this strange current. Fragile, human, and terrifyingly real. As we stepped outside, the city hummed softly around us. Daniel walked beside me, his hands tucked in his pockets, his breath visible in the cold night air. "I used to hate that night," he said quietly. "But now I think maybe it was meant to lead me here." I looked at him, unsure how to respond. The street was nearly empty. "You mean, here, with me?" He shrugged, his smile small but sincere. "Maybe. Life has strange ways of looping back." I nodded, still reeling. Part of me wanted to apologize again, to ask him why he wasn't angry, why he could forgive me so easily. But the understanding in his expression stopped me. When we reached the corner, he gestured toward the bridge. "I walk this way," he said. "It helps me think." Before I could stop myself, I asked, "Do you want me to walk with you?" He hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." We walked in silence, our footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. The water below us shimmered like liquid glass. After a few minutes, Daniel said softly, "You looked scared that night." "I was," I admitted. "I still am sometimes." He smiled, his eyes catching the light from the street lamps. "So am I. But I'm still here." That simple sentence, it hit me harder than anything else. It was both a confession and a promise, one survivor recognizing another. When we finally said goodbye, he reached out and gently squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Ethan," he whispered, "for calling that night, for coming tonight, for both." I stood there long after he'd walked away, watching him disappear into the night. The guilt was still there, but it had changed. It was softer now, reshaped into something that almost felt like purpose. Driving home, his words replayed in my head. "You watched me bleed that night." I didn't know what this connection meant, or where it would lead. But one thing was clear. Daniel had reopened something in me I thought was long gone. And deep down, beneath the confusion, a single thought sparked in the... Over the next few weeks, Daniel became a quiet part of my life. Like a song I couldn't stop replaying. Not because it was catchy, but because it said something I didn't know I needed to hear. We met for coffee on slow afternoons, took walks by the river, and sometimes sat in silence, letting the air between us fill with unspoken things. I told myself it was just friendship, but deep down I knew it was more. Something softer, deeper, almost sacred. Daniel had this way of noticing things most people missed. He remembered how I took my coffee. Too much cream. Barely any sugar. He remembered how I always looked away when I laughed. He even noticed when I was about to retreat into my own head, and would gently bring me back with a small joke or a quiet, "Stay with me." But for all the warmth he offered, there was also a distance. Certain questions made him retreat. Whenever the conversation brushed against his past, his voice would change, become slower, deliberate, as if each word had to pass through a filter of memory and pain. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the cafe windows, I noticed him tracing a faint scar on his wrist. It wasn't new, but it looked deliberate. An old story, written on skin. "Does it still hurt?" I asked without thinking. He looked up, startled, then gave a faint, tired smile. Not the way it used to. I wanted to ask what happened, but something in his eyes told me he'd already had to explain himself too many times in life. So I stayed quiet. But that night, as we parted, he said something that stuck with me. "Everyone carries scars, Ethan. Some are just harder to see." The next time we met, it was at his apartment. He'd invited me over for dinner, saying he wanted to cook for once instead of relying on cafe menus. His place was simple, almost bare. A few framed photos, a bookshelf full of novels, and a small plant on the windowsill that looked like it was surviving purely out of stubbornness. We ate pasta and talked about ordinary things: work, music, bad television. For the first time in years, I felt comfortable in someone else's space, like I wasn't being measured or compared. But midway through dinner, Daniel grew quiet. His fork rested untouched on the plate. I looked up and saw that distant expression again, the one that came when he was fighting something unseen. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally. "And before I do, I need you to understand that it's not easy for me." My chest tightened. "You can tell me anything." He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath, as though bracing himself against invisible weight. "That night you saw me, when I was attacked. It wasn't random. They weren't strangers." I froze, unsure what to say. "They were people I knew," he continued softly. "People who found out about me." "Found out what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked straight into my eyes, and for the first time I saw real fear there. Not fear of me, but of what my reaction might be. "I was born intersex," he said, each word deliberate, careful. "It means I wasn't born entirely male or female. My body, it doesn't fit the boxes people like to use." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my breath catch, not from confusion or shock, but from the sheer courage it must have taken for him to say it out loud. He looked down at his hands. "All my life, people have tried to decide what I should be. Doctors, teachers, even my own parents. When I got older, I thought moving away would mean I could start over. But that night, someone from work found out. They told others, and then—" He trailed off, his voice trembling. "I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. The police came, but I couldn't even bring myself to explain what happened. I just told them I fell. I was so tired of being a story people stared at." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things words couldn't express: shame, anger, resilience, survival. Finally, I said softly, "I'm so sorry, Daniel." He looked up, his eyes glistening under the warm apartment light. "Don't be. It's not pity I need. I just needed to tell you who I am. I didn't want to keep pretending." "You don't have to pretend with me," I said, meaning every word. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw something unguarded in his expression. A small, almost imperceptible flicker of relief. We sat there for a long time, saying nothing. The rain outside had turned heavier, blurring the world into a wash of gray and gold, At some point, I reached across the table and took his hand. He didn't pull away. "I don't see you as broken," I whispered. "I see you as someone who survived something no one should have to survive." His lips trembled, and then, without warning, he began to cry. Quietly, almost silently, like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be comforted. I didn't move. I just let him cry, his hand still in mine, the sound of rain filling the spaces between us. After a while, he wiped his face and gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Sorry. I'm not usually like this." "You don't have to apologize for being human," I said gently. He smiled faintly. "You make it sound simple." "Maybe it is," I replied. "Maybe people just make it harder than it needs to be." That night, as I drove home, the world felt heavier and lighter all at once. Heavy with the truth he'd shared. Light with the quiet honor of having been trusted with it. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not just about what he'd been through, but about how he carried himself despite it all. For the first time, I realized that what drew me to Daniel wasn't just his calm or his kindness. It was his strength, the kind that came from rebuilding yourself piece by piece after the world had tried to tear you apart. When I got home, I sat by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, and thought about everything he'd said. About the night I saw him bleed, about the courage it took to survive, and about how two broken people could somehow find wholeness in each other. I didn't know what would come next, or whether I was capable of giving him the peace he deserved. But one thing was certain. I wanted to try. Because somewhere between guilt and gratitude, between fear and understanding, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I'd never been good at understanding what love really meant. Not the kind that stays steady after the world stops applauding. With Daniel, it wasn't about fireworks or grand gestures. It was quiet. It was the way he made space for silence, but still managed to fill it with warmth. It was how, even after telling me everything, he'd look at me, waiting for me to decide if I could handle his truth. After his confession, every conversation carried a new depth. We stopped dancing around delicate subjects. But the world outside our little bubble wasn't so kind. At work, my friend Sarah noticed the change. She teased me about smiling more, about checking my phone. But when she saw a picture of us walking along the river, her expression shifted. It wasn't judgment, just confusion. "He seems nice," she said, so carefully. "You really like him?" I nodded, but my chest tightened. I could hear what she didn't say, and that unspoken hesitation stuck with me. The world kept reminding me of its boundaries. One night at dinner, a man at a nearby table whispered something crude. Daniel heard it. He said nothing, just kept eating, but his hands trembled slightly. I wanted to explode, to shout, to do anything. But Daniel gave me a look that just pleaded, "Please, don't." So I stayed quiet, and that silence burned all the way home. When we got to his apartment, he turned to me and said softly, "You don't have to fight every battle for me. Someone should," I insisted. "You don't deserve that." He gave a sad smile. "I've been hearing worse things for years. I learned that people's ignorance isn't mine to fix. But it's not fair," I argued. "You shouldn't have to just forgive the world for being cruel." He looked at me, his eyes clear. "I'm not forgiving it," he said. "I'm surviving it. There's a difference." I couldn't stop thinking about that. I admired his strength, but I hated the world for making him need it. And I hated myself for realizing I wasn't as brave as he was. It happened again at work, this time more direct. My coworker Matt cornered me by the coffee machine, smirking. "So, I heard about your new boyfriend," he said. "You sure that's what you're into now?" I froze. It was how he said it, like love was just some weird curiosity. I managed to say, "What I'm into is none of your business." He just chuckled, raising his hands. "Hey, no judgment. Just didn't think you were, that kind of guy." That kind of guy. The words clung to me all day like a stain. I went home feeling small, angry, and ashamed of my own shame. When Daniel opened the door, he knew immediately. "Rough day?" I just nodded, slumping onto the couch. "People are cruel," I muttered. He sat beside me, his voice calm. Did someone say something? I buried my face in my hands. I thought I could handle it. I thought it wouldn't matter. But I hate that they can make me feel like I am doing something wrong just by loving you. There was a long silence. Then, Daniel said quietly, "You think I don't feel that too?" I looked up, and the pain in his eyes made my chest ache. "Every day," he said. "Every look, every whisper. It still gets to me. But I learned a long time ago that shame only wins when you start believing it belongs to you. And it doesn't. It never did." I reached for his hand. "Then teach me how to let it go." He smiled, his fingers tightening around mine. "That's the thing about love, Ethan. It's not supposed to make you someone new. It's supposed to make you more of who you already are." That evening, we sat on his balcony. He told me about his counseling work, how he helped others who'd been rejected, how he found meaning in just listening. I realized then that his compassion wasn't some endless well of kindness. It came from his own pain, from deciding he would never let anyone else feel unseen if he could help it. And I understood that loving Daniel wasn't about protecting him. It was about standing beside him. One weekend, he invited me to an LGBTQ+ support event at a community center. I hesitated, unsure if I belonged, but he insisted gently. "You don't have to understand everything," he said. "You just have to show up." So I did. And for the first time, I saw Daniel completely at ease. He moved through the room with quiet confidence, greeting people, laughing freely. I watched him talk to a young person who looked terrified, and I saw how his calmness eased their fear. He wasn't just surviving, he was helping others survive too. Later, I told him, "You're incredible, you know that?" He just smiled shyly. "No, I just decided not to hide anymore." As we walked home that night, the city felt gentler. The same streets that once felt hostile now seemed alive with possibility. I realized love isn't about finding someone to complete you. It's about finding someone who reminds you that you were already whole. But love doesn't erase fear completely. There were still moments I wondered if we could really exist in a world that insisted on labels. Yet every time I started to spiral, Daniel would reach for my hand and ground me. "Don't let them take the peace we've built," he'd whisper. And I'd believe him. His presence felt like truth, steady, undeniable, and worth fighting for. As winter began to settle in, we grew closer, our lives intertwining. Still, there was a shadow I couldn't name. Something unspoken in the way he'd sometimes stare at the horizon, lost in thought. I sensed he was keeping something from me, not out of deceit, but to protect me. I didn't press him. I just watched, memorizing the quiet strength in his smile, completely unaware that the peace we had built was about to be tested in a way neither of us saw coming. For the first time in my life, I had something real to lose. And that realization terrified me more than anything else. It was a Friday evening when everything I thought I understood about Daniel, and about us, changed. The air carried that sharp bite of winter, and the streets shimmered under the dull orange of streetlights. I was supposed to meet him for dinner, just like any other night. He'd texted me earlier. "Let's talk tonight. There's something I've been meaning to tell you." At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he wanted to plan something for the holidays. Or maybe it was about that job he'd been considering in another city. But when I saw him sitting at the cafe window, staring out into the street with this faraway look, I felt a tremor of unease. When I walked in, he smiled, but it was faint, forced. "Hey," he said softly, standing up to greet me. His hands were cold when they brushed against mine. "Hey yourself," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice carried a tremor I couldn't hide. We ordered coffee, though neither of us really touched it. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, the hum of soft music filling the empty spaces between us. Then Daniel spoke, his tone careful, almost like he'd rehearsed it. "Ethan, do you remember the night we first met? The accident?" I blinked, completely thrown off. "Of course. You were the guy I helped that night. You were bleeding, scared. You barely even spoke." He nodded slowly. "That night wasn't the first time you saw me." I frowned, confusion twisting in my gut. What do you mean? He exhaled shakily, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that just froze me in place. You watched me bleed that night, but not just from an accident. It was the night I stopped being someone else. The words didn't make any sense at first. My heart was pounding as I tried to piece it all together. Daniel, what are you saying? He looked down, tears glistening in his eyes. Before that night, I wasn't Daniel. I was living under another name, a name that never felt like mine. I had been attacked that evening because someone found out who I really was. You didn't just help a stranger. You helped me survive the night I became myself for the first time. The cafe around us just seemed to fade away. The clinking of cups, the chatter, the music, all of it dissolved into silence. I could only hear the faint tremor in his voice and the sound of my own breath catching in my throat. My mind raced back to that night. His trembling hands, the pure fear in his eyes, the blood soaking his shirt. I remembered how he whispered that he didn't want to go to the hospital, how he begged me not to tell anyone. At the time, I just thought it was fear of getting into trouble. But now I saw it completely differently. Daniel, I whispered, my throat tightening. You mean, that was the night you… He nodded. Yes, I had just started transitioning. I thought I was finally free. But someone from my past didn't want to let me go. They followed me, cornered me. And when you found me on that street, I thought I was dying. But you stayed. You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. You just helped me breathe. Tears welled up in my eyes before I could stop them. I reached across the table and took his hand. It was trembling, but he didn't pull away. All this time, I said softly, you carried that alone? He gave a weak smile. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was afraid that if you knew, you'd see me differently, that you'd stop seeing me at all. I shook my head. No, Daniel, you don't get it. I didn't fall for who you used to be, or who people said you were. I fell for you. The person who listens, who fights to exist every single day, who has more courage than anyone I know. For the first time that night, he laughed. It was a small, broken sound, but it was real. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, the heaviness between us lightened. But then his expression shifted again. There's something else, he said. The man who attacked me. He's out. He found out where I work. He's been sending messages. A cold dread crept through me. Daniel, you need to go to the police. I did, he said. But they said without direct threats there's nothing they can do. I don't want you caught in the middle of this. Don't you dare shut me out, I said, my voice trembling. Not now. You don't get to carry this alone anymore. He looked at me for a long time, his jaw tightening, and then he finally nodded. Okay. That night, I walked him home. The city felt different. Darker. Quieter. Like it was holding its breath. We talked about everything and nothing at all. He told me more about the years before we met. About the loneliness, the fear, the endless fight just to be seen. Each word felt like a wound he had carried for too long, finally finding air. When we reached his apartment, he turned to me and said, You know, that night you found me, I thought I was invisible. I thought no one would ever really see me. But you did. You didn't even know me, but you stayed. I swallowed hard. And I'll keep staying, no matter what. He smiled, a real one this time. Then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't the kind of kiss that burned with urgency. It was one that healed. A promise. A homecoming. Weeks passed after that night. The man who had threatened him eventually disappeared, though the fear lingered in small ways, in the way Daniel double-checked locks, in how his eyes darted toward shadows. But together, we learned to rebuild the quiet. One evening, months later, we sat again by the river where we'd first talked after our first date. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the water shimmered with soft light. He rested his head on my shoulder and whispered, You changed my story, Ethan. You turned a night of bleeding into the beginning of living. I smiled, tightening my arm around him. You changed mine too. You taught me that love isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about standing beside someone until they remember they were never broken to begin with. He looked up at me, his eyes glistening. Do you think people like us ever get happy endings? I paused, thinking about it. Maybe not the kind in movies, I said. But the kind we build, day by day? I think we already have ours. He smiled faintly and whispered, Then let's keep writing it. As the sky dimmed and the city lights flickered across the river, I realized something profound. Love doesn't always arrive wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it comes bleeding, trembling, and uncertain, but real. And maybe, just maybe, that's the truest kind there is. That night, as I held Daniel close, I knew one thing for certain. Our story wasn't ending. It was just finally being told in full light. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If it touched you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more. It means the world to us.